Hey guys, welcome back to another YouTube video. In today's video, guys, we're going to be going over the biggest 2023 movie surprises and disappointments, and it is finally 2024, and I hope you guys had an amazing 2023. Hope you guys had a great New Year's holiday season overall. I hope you guys enjoyed your Christmas, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, it is officially 2024, and pretty soon we're going to be moving on from talking about 2023 movies and talking about the 2024 movies. I just have this video and then my end of the year tier list where I talk about all of the movies that I watched in 2023, which is going to be very, very fun, but also very, very exhausting for me. So make sure you stay tuned for that. That's probably going to be the biggest release of January, as January is usually a pretty slow month for movies. I do have a few on my radar, but don't expect a whole lot of movie reviews this month. And so, yeah, that's pretty much what's going to be going on. Make sure you catch up if you haven't watched my past few reviews and past few end-of-the-year rankings. Make sure you catch up on those before you go ahead and see my end-of-the-year ranking, which is going to be coming out next. And I think that's pretty much it. And so before I get on to this video, by the way, none of these are in particular order. I'm going to be going over the disappointments first so we can go... so that we can end on a good note, and then I'm going to be going over the surprises, and none of these, like I said, are in particular order. But, yeah, I mean, just, like, looking back at this, when I put this list together, it really surprised me how many surprises I had in 2023, and I think that really just had to do with this is obviously the biggest year of movies for me, and I really expanded my movie taste in 2023 and watched a lot of movies that normally I would never be interested in seeing, and so I think that's why I just ended up having a lot of big surprises for 2023 and only really a handful of disappointments. We only had five. I only have five on my list of disappointments and a crap ton to go over for my surprises. So I do want to make my explanation short and sweet, so that's about it. Let's get straight into it. So for my first disappointment, like I said, in no particular order, and I really hate to put this one here, but I don't know what it is. It just seems like throughout the year I've liked this movie less and less, and just seem to not really remember maybe some of the parts that I did enjoy about this movie, and that is Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. And I don't know, there's just not a lot of parts about this movie that I remember liking, and I think the reason why this is sort of a disappointment for me is because there was a lot of early hype about this movie. There were a lot of early access screenings where people were saying this was a really, really great experience for them, and I think, truthfully, what happened there was likely a lot of those people who go to those early access screenings were probably big D&D fans who were with other D&D players, and so they're bound to have a really good experience. And so the reviews looked really good for these for this movie before I went to it, and I just ended up kind of having a mediocre movie experience where it was okay, like it was a watch. Would I ever rewatch this movie? Probably not, but it was good for what it was. But I just remember less and less about the stuff that I liked about this movie, unfortunately. So, I don't know, D&D Honor Among Thieves, it ends up on this list. I mean, maybe it was just the atmosphere that I watched this movie in, I'm not really sure, but I just find myself not really remembering a whole lot of great stuff about it. Next up, we have The Creator, which is an interesting movie on this list, because I feel like this was a big year for smaller movie studios and for, you know, smaller movie companies and whatnot, and for just indie films in general. And The Creator is by no means, I would say, an indie film, but it definitely does not have as big of budgets as many other films. And so I really do admire the visuals of The Creator and whatnot. And I think that's what sold this movie for a lot of people, is they were looking at this movie and they're like, wow, this movie has a fairly small budget. It looks really, really good. I want to go check this out. And so there was like quite a bit of early buzz for it. People seemed to be pretty excited for it. And then for me, I mean, for some people really like this movie still, but for me, this was a very, very mediocre sci-fi film overall. I just was not invested in the story at all. Like I said, the visuals still looked very, very good for the budget that this movie has, considering the very, very high budgets that we've seen in movies this year. The Creator did a very good job on the visual side, but on the actual story side, this just turned out to be one of the most mediocre sci-fi movies of the year for me. And there were even some other sci-fi movies that came out this year that weren't really so focused on that aspect. They were kind of like, yeah, this movie is very much a sci-fi movie, but there was other movies where they had like sci-fi elements to it, and I kind of enjoyed those movies a little bit more. And so I don't know, the creator just ended up being kind of a little bit of a disappointment for me. Like I said, the visuals were pretty good, but I just was not invested in the story at all. Next up, we have Five Nights at Freddy's, and I will say before I like discuss the issues I had with this movie as far as it being disappointing for me, I still had a pleasant experience with Five Nights at Freddy's. I'm not a huge FNAF fan, but I knew as soon as I watched this movie there was going to be a lot of things in here that FNAF fans would love, and I overall did like the story. I connected with the story quite a bit. I like Josh Hutcherson in this movie, and so I still had an enjoyable experience for it. But for me, video game adaptations just never really seem to reach their full potential, I guess you want to say. They never really capture that video game fully. It seems like, obviously, to make a movie, you have to put some amount of story in there, and then it just seems like there's something always lost in between there, and they can't really make an immersive experience where it very much is a movie with a functioning story, but you also feel like you're in the video game, or there are like elements to it that are very, very like much a fundamental part of the video game that it is trying to adapt. And with Five Nights at Freddy's, it's just the fact that I was really surprised that for a FNAF movie that there was a very, very much a lack of jump scares in here. And so overall, it just ended up being a decent horror movie. It's a very entry-level horror movie. I think anybody who's not a huge horror fan can watch this movie for the first time, like if they're trying to get into horror, and they won't be, this would be a very, very good first watch for them, I would say. But I don't know, I guess I was expecting a lot more jump scares out of this movie, and I think that would have really, really enhanced the experience overall, because other than the story, it wasn't. I just don't think it reached the full potential that it could have reached, I suppose. So Five Nights at Freddy's makes it on this list. Next up, we have Napoleon, and I would say that out of all of these on this list of disappointments, this was probably the one that I enjoyed the most. I would say that for all of this movie's flaws, just like Napoleon's flaws, I still really enjoyed the movie overall. I loved the battle sequences. I loved some of our main performances, particularly Joaquin Phoenix and Vanessa Kirby. I loved how it was just able to capture the time period very, very well. And I would say that out of all of the biopics I watched this year, I felt like this one really was able to capture the time period probably the best, in my opinion. But that still doesn't cut away from the fact that I feel like this film just felt like a monologue of Napoleon's events. And I get it. Napoleon is not an easy character to make a movie about. At least how would you want to say, a regular length movie. Like, I feel like to fully study Napoleon and really go in depth into all the things that he has done, you would need an entire show about it. And so putting it into a movie form, I know obviously is not very easy, and I had my doubts going into it that like they weren't going to be able to really go in depth on his character. And so overall the movie just ended up being sort of a monologue of the major events of Napoleon's life without really going into depth in anything, really tying anything together, and not really having much character development. It's just kind of like, okay, we're in this year, and then all of a sudden we're jumping to this next year with this, and we're in this new battle or whatever. And so there's not really any through line throughout this movie. There's not really any natural progression. It's just going from one time point to the next. And so yeah, I had my doubts going into it, and I realized that this is not a very easy film to pull off if you want to make an in-depth cohesive story about Napoleon. But I feel like this movie just had so much potential. I feel like had they made a few adjustments to some of their decisions with like the plot, had they maybe not have focused on the love side of things so much, because I feel like that's one of the fatal flaws with a lot of these biopics, is they just invest way too much time into the love interest and the love story. I think that this movie could have been up there a little bit further. I don't know. I can't put things into words right now, but that's essentially my thoughts on Napoleon. I still really enjoyed it, but was probably by far, if I did put this in order, my biggest disappointment of the year. And for my last disappointment of 2023, this is yet again another historical drama. Seems like there's been a lot of historical dramas and biopics in 2023. This one in particular is mainly a sports drama, but I guess you could still throw it in there just because of its time period. And there just hasn't really been a whole lot of talk about this movie. I haven't really seen any movie reviews for it and anything like that. And that is The Boys in the Boat. And, I mean, I don't know. Like I said, Napoleon was the biggest disappointment of the year, but maybe this was even, like, of a bigger disappointment because, I'm quite a fan of sports dramas. I know that sounds oddly specific, but I do like sports dramas, and The Boys in the Boat, obviously I was going to go check it out, just because there's been a whole lot of these types of movies throughout the year, and I like sports dramas, like I said. And the concept sounded interesting enough. It was about this 30s rowing team who won the Summer Olympics in Berlin, and so we kind of get a backstory of some of our characters some of our people on the rowing team, as well as the coach and whatnot. And I don't know. It seems like I really wanted to like this movie throughout it. But, as time's progressed, I've just realized that there's just so much, how do you want to say it? So much lost potential, I guess. This movie had a lot more potential, kind of like with Napoleon, but just did not get there. And I think it only really succeeded at being a decent sports drama at best, because there are just so many underdeveloped characters in this movie, so many characters that I wish they would explore more, and that I thought were more interesting than our main character himself, funnily enough, that they just didn't explore very well. And on top of that, this was probably, I just did not care for the love interest / love story at all in this movie. I felt like it was a complete waste of time. They didn't even come back to it by the ending of the movie. Like, after they win their little Olympic race or whatever, they don't really conclude much throughout the movie. They just go back to this scene from the beginning of the movie that we never talked about throughout the entire movie. Never, it was just a scene at the beginning of the movie, and we finally come back to it in the end and get this one little moment where it kind of puts a little grin on your face. But that's pretty much it for The Boys in the Boat. So, I don't know. I'm stuck in between Napoleon and The Boys in the Boat for my biggest disappointment of the year. And I don't know. I think it might just be Boys in the Boat because I was expecting a lot more out of this film. I like this particular genre of movies, and it just had so much potential to really capture, kind of like with what Napoleon did well, the time period, especially the Great Depression. I find the 20th century history very interesting, and they could have really captured that time period of the Great Depression a lot better, and they just barely touched on it at all. And there are a few things as far as capturing the time period that they hinted at throughout the film. Like, there was this whole thing with, they had Hitler watching the race in Berlin, obviously, as it takes place in Berlin, Germany, and this is when Hitler reigned Germany or whatever. And they had this little thing that I did like, where there was this black athlete that showed up to the Olympics game. And if you don't know, Hitler was kind of one of those people who said that, they shouldn't be allowed in the Olympics or they would never be good or whatever. And so it's just kind of like a nice nod, like, hey, this guy has made it this far. Obviously that's not true or whatever. So I kind of did there was a few hints throughout the film is basically what I'm trying to get at, that I did like, and there was a few standout scenes as well, but that's about it. This just overall ended up being a decent sports drama and left me with a small grin on my face. But that perfectly describes this movie. It'll give you a small grin, but nothing really more than that. So The Boys in the Boat might really just be my biggest disappointment of the year. And so let's move on to the biggest surprises of the year. So for my first one, and like I said, it's still in no particular order, it is Megan, which when I saw the trailer for this movie, I thought this was an absolutely ridiculous concept. I was not buying this movie at all. Not as much as I was buying Winnie the Pooh Blood and Honey when I saw the trailer for that movie first. And ended up, hearing a lot of really good things about this movie. The reviews, a lot of really positive things about it, and not just about enjoying it or having a fun time with the Megan doll or whatever and the goofiness of it all, but the actual story and theme itself, which is very, very relevant to today and the fears that we have today with like AI and it taking over the world or whatever. But in this particular movie, it's talking about how AI could affect parenting and education in the future and whatnot, and should we let AI, like how much should we let AI teach our kids and whatnot, like where's the boundary line or whatever. So there was a lot more that this movie explored. Well, I wasn't expecting this movie to really explore any modern day elements at all, but it went in a lot more depth than I would have ever thought. So, Megan, one of the biggest surprises of the year for me. Next up, we have Missing, which I know that I found out shortly after I watched this movie that there was a sort of kind of in the same category of this movie, sort of a spin-off, kind of like with Unfriended and Unfriended the Dark Web, called Searching, that came a few years before, and this is sort of like I said, a sequel / spin-off version of that kind of movie. And the concept was interesting enough to get me invested in it, but I wasn't confident that this was going to be the concept was going to be scary or interesting enough for me to really like it. But it ended up being one of the most thrilling and enjoyable experience, or I guess thrilling edge of the seat experiences that I had in 2023. I really, really loved Missing. I just loved how things unfolded throughout the movie so perfectly, and just made the experience how every thriller should be, where you're learning about things. You're learning at the same pace as your characters are throughout the movie, and trying to figure out what's going on, trying to look at those smaller details and whatnot. And I think it really works well in this particular subgenre of horror, where on a computer screen and you're trying to kind of look at all these different little Easter eggs thrown in there and whatnot. And so Missing just worked really, really well for me. It was probably one of my favorite horror movies in this little subgenre of horror. I definitely would consider this more of a thriller than a horror movie, but you know what I mean. I really enjoyed Missing. Definitely one of the most thrilling experiences of 2023 for me. Next up, we have Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, and I think really the only reason why this was a big surprise for me is just because of the recent reputation for the MCU. I was very, very worried about this movie going into it, that it was going to have a lot of those MCU-isms, as many people like to say. But James Gunn, it felt like he was able to really make his own film in here. And, man, I just really hope that MCU learns from that, and that they let their directors make their own movies. And really trust their directors to do that. I would rather have a director like like in Barbie be able to go all out, even though I don't love Barbie and like agree with the director in all of her beliefs and whatnot. I still really enjoyed that movie because she was clearly able to make her own story and be creative and do really whatever she wanted. And I just wish that MCU, the MCU, the higher-ups, the parliament of the MCU would really just let their directors do their own thing and really trust them to be able to put out a really good movie, and not focus on future MCU films and future releases and whatnot so much. And Guardians of the Galaxy 3 was just that. And so I was really worried about this movie going into it, but I really enjoyed it, and this was a very, very heartfelt, emotional movie for me, and a very, very great conclusion to the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy. We have Elemental, which obviously, as I'm getting older, not really as into kids movies anymore, or animated films and whatnot. But Elemental, I really, really enjoyed this film. I felt like it was just, I just thought this was just a sweet little Pixar film that just has not gotten enough talk about. I feel like the animation, I think, looks really, really nice. Obviously Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse came out in the same month, so that was getting a lot more praise than this movie, but I'm not gonna the animation in this film deserves a lot more credit. I think they did a really good job, and I just like the story overall. This was a bit of a different story for Disney and Pixar, kind of a bit of a rom-com type of story, and I just really enjoyed it. I enjoyed our two main characters in this movie. I just thought it was a sweet little Disney rom-com, and I just wish that Disney, kind of like what I just said with Guardians of the Galaxy, would just put out original films and not continue to rehash the same things that we've seen over and over and over again, and just trust their instincts and come up with a unique story, because oftentimes that works more than just rehashing something that we're already familiar with. So Elemental, one of the bigger surprises for me. Next up, we have Mission Impossible 7, and the only reason why this is on this list is because I have never seen a Mission Impossible film prior to this, and with how long this film was, I wasn't sure, despite the fact that Tom Cruise is in it, how much I was going to enjoy this film. But I ended up really loving this film, and I will absolutely continue to watch any of the next Mission Impossible movies come out. I'm fully invested in this franchise, and I was just very surprised at how this, like, the 7th movie in the franchise was able to get me hooked on so easily, because I just loved this film. One of my favorite action films of the year, probably my favorite action film of the year. I just freaking loved it. And Tom Cruise, for his age, it's really incredible what he's still able to do. And so that's the only reason that is on here. I know some people are like, that was surprising to you. But like I said, I've never seen a Mission Impossible film prior to it. And I really, really love this one. So it goes on this list. Next up, we have The Last Voyage of the Demeter. And this was one that there was, I watched quite a few reviews before watching it. And so... And most people did not have as a positive an experience for this movie as I did. I really, really enjoyed The Last Voyage of the Demeter. I really liked the atmosphere. I really liked the brutal, gruesome kills from the Dracula killer. And yeah, like I said, you just watching the reviews before it obviously wasn't going to make me more excited for this movie. There wasn't a whole lot of positive reviews for this film, so I feel like I'm kind of in a smaller boat, no pun intended, for this film. But I really liked The Last Voyage of the Demeter, and I'm honestly really excited for the next chapter, so to speak, in this series of movies, because it is based off of a Dracula novel. And so, yeah, I'm really excited for the next chapter. I was very surprised at how much I enjoyed this movie. So that's why it makes it on here. So we got Blue Beetle, and I really thought that from the start of the year, that a lot of, like, all of the DCEU films were just doomed. Like, none of them, all of them were destined to just fail, which, I mean, all of them did lose DCEU, or did lose the Warner Bros. Money, obviously, but I just felt like, all of these remaining DCEU films were just probably going to be really bad, and that there really wasn't going to be any sort of purpose to it. But Blue Beetle, I just felt like was the most surprising to me, because the Flash, it seemed like with the Flash, okay, maybe there's a little bit of hope for the Flash because it's the Flash, right? And it's got Michael Keaton, and, we've never really had a Flash film before, at least in a long time. And so, it seems like maybe there's some hope for it. And then we have Aquaman 2, which just came out a few weeks ago, that I actually had a pretty pleasant experience with. That, obviously that movie made $1 billion, a few years ago, and it's got Jason Momoa in it. So maybe there's, a little bit of hope for it. And then you had Shazam, but Blue Beetle, not really many people are very familiar with this character. It's coming out in August, kind of more of a dead season. That's when people are starting to go back to school and whatnot. And so I was like, this movie, I don't even really know. But then I heard a lot of positive things about this movie, and I was planning on seeing it, but I wasn't super enthusiastic about it. And then I ended up really enjoying this film. I just love the family-oriented aspect of it. I just thought it was so pleasant, so refreshing, and I just really enjoyed this movie overall. Even though it is very familiar, there's, especially the main superhero itself, very, very similar to, like, Ant-Man and Iron Man, obviously. But I still really enjoyed this movie. I love the family-oriented aspect. I'm a big George Lopez fan, so I really liked him in here. So I really enjoyed Blue Beetle, and I thought it was just a very pleasant experience. Next up on this list, and if I were to put these in order, this would definitely be at either the number 1 or number 2 spot on here, and that is Gran Turismo. And if there's any movie that I had more doubt for, that is this movie, because as I've already talked with Five Nights at Freddy's, I am just not very faithful in a lot of video game adaptations. I do not trust them to actually adapt the game and put in, like, key elements of the game that we love about them. And I'm not really a big Gran Turismo fan. I wasn't sold on the concept. I thought it was kind of ridiculous. I kind of had the same reaction as David Harbour did when he found out that he has to coach a bunch of kids who play a racing simulator game who think that they're actually going to be in racing. So I had so many doubts for this film, and I didn't really see a lot of reviews before it, thankfully. and I turned out to be super surprised. I am actually quite a bit of fan of underdog stories, which is why I'm also quite a bit of fan of sports dramas. And so I would say this is definitely one of those higher tier underdog stories. I just really enjoyed it. This movie overall just put a big smile on my face at the ending of it. I loved the racing sequences. I love David Harbour in here. I like our main lead actor in here as well. I like the simulator sequences where we're in kind of the game itself, where we're making it seem like we're in a simulation or whatever. I thought that those worked really, really well. And so overall, Gran Turismo just put a huge smile on my face. This is definitely a higher quality underdog story, and even though I had a bunch of doubt for this movie, I walked away pretty happy. Next up on this list, and thinking about it, this one would definitely be at number one, and I'm sure you've already guessed it, and that is Saw X. It's really crazy how this movie has managed to jump to the top of many people's rankings for the Saw franchise, and not just the Saw franchise, actually, to the top of many people's horror rankings for the year. And if you would have told me at the beginning of the year that a sequel to Saw was going to be not only my favorite Saw movie in the entire franchise, but also one of my favorite horror movies of the year. Actually, I did put this at number one, so it was my favorite horror movie of the year. I would have told you were crazy. And when I saw the trailer for this movie, I was like, okay, whatever. I'm up for another Saw sequel, but I wasn't thinking that this was gonna be the best Saw movie ever. And I mean, thinking back at it, it does make sense. When you take your main focus of all of the Saw films and you just put them front and center, what do you know? It works really, really well. And it just feels like the Saw franchise has gotten so carried away from where it started, but here it really just focuses itself and just goes back to the basics. We go back to that original color palette. This movie does have a lot of the original directors and producers from the first few Saw films behind it. So we go back to that original color palette, original theme, dialogue, all that kind of stuff. And it really just feels like it is actually one of the earlier Saw entries. And it does take place between the first Saw movie and the second Saw movie. And so I think that they do that really, really well. And it doesn't go over the top with the traps or anything like that, although I do think that the traps are fairly good. It doesn't have an overly convoluted story or whatnot. And you really, really hate the villains in here. They have a legitimate reason to be tested in this film, while also I feel like they did a good job at exposing some of the hypocrisies of Jigsaw's moral code, which I hope that they will expand more in the future Saw films. So overall, Saw X, I don't want to get into too much depth with a lot of these movies because that's not what I'm here to do, but Saw X, it's really just crazy how this movie has jumped all the way to the top to many people's rankings. A few months ago when I saw the trailer for this, I would have never thought in a million years that would have been the case. So Saw X, definitely, looking back at it, the biggest surprise of the year for me. Next up, you got Godzilla -1. And I'll say right off the bat, I am not as enthusiastic about this film as many other people are. Some people have put this at the top of their movie rankings in general, and some people, this is their most favorite movie of the year and whatnot. I'm not on that train exactly, but I still really did like this movie. I have actually never seen a Godzilla film prior to this. And I've never seen a Japanese-made film either. This is one of the first films that I've ever seen where it takes place completely in a foreign language and where I have to read subtitles. I was really hoping that I could watch a dubbed version, but there was only a subtitles version. And so I didn't want to skip this movie because I just heard so much great things about it. And it's a Godzilla movie. Now that I'm really into movies, how could I pass up on a Godzilla movie? And I really liked Godzilla -1. It wasn't as unpleasant of an experience as I was expecting, because I'm just generally not a person who likes to read subtitles throughout the entire movie just because it feels like I'm not able to focus on the movie as much. But I was able to really understand what was going on in the movie and understand our characters and what they were going through and their devastation. And I wasn't rooting for Godzilla in this film. Like, I actually felt for the characters and realized the amount of tragedy and devastation that all these people in Japan had gone through. And so it was one of the many few Godzilla films, as people have pointed out, where you're not rooting for Godzilla. And he's very, very terrifying. He's a big threat. And so I really enjoyed Godzilla -1. I'm not on the train where I think this is the best movie of the year or whatnot. I did think it kind of dragged along a little bit for me, but again, maybe that's just like the atmosphere that I was in. Sometimes I'm just kind of tired, or I wasn't really in the mood to watch a movie, but I still really enjoyed Godzilla -1. I think that the story and the characters are all very, very solid and compelling, and so it definitely goes on my list for one of the biggest surprises of the year. Next up, we have Wonka, which is another one where I had quite a bit of doubt for, and I don't know, maybe it was a foolish doubt, because when I saw the trailer for it, I will admit it looked pretty pleasant. I'm not a huge Timothée Chalamet fan. I'm not a huge Willy Wonka fan or whatnot. When I was a kid, I definitely was, but I'm not overly enthusiastic about Willy Wonka. I really love the original 1970 Willy Wonka. I think the Tim Burton one is just a little weird. It just has a lot of really dark elements that I'm not a big fan of to it. But this looked like a pleasant movie overall. But I was like, really, another Willy Wonka film? And it's not even like the original format. It's like going into the backstory. I'm like, I don't really care that much. But I watched the movie, and it was a very pleasant experience. I just liked how it was focused on the charming musical aspect of the Willy Wonka story, and not so much the darker elements to it that I very much realize are an essential part of that original story. But I just liked how it was focused on being a pleasant, charming, energetic, uplifting movie, and not so focused on like the darker elements. And so I really like this movie. Very, very energetic. And so, yeah, one of the bigger surprises of the year. And for my last surprise of the year, which was conveniently one of the last movie, well, would have been, yeah, chronologically the last movie I seen on this list, and that is The Iron Claw. This is one that I found out about very, very late, and threw on my list because, you know, I was very, very desperate to reach my 50 goal. The concept was interesting enough. It's yet again another historical drama, I guess you want to say. And I'm not a huge wrestling fan at all. But this was legitimately one of the most devastating and emotionally impactful movies that I have ever watched. And might go down as probably the best movie of the year for me. I'm still trying to decide. But this movie surprised me so much that it might very well be the best movie of the year for me. This was such an emotionally tragic and gut-punching film, but it was so great at the same time. I love The Iron Claw. I'll go into more depth when I do my end of the year tier list. If you can see me go in more depth if you watch the review. But yeah, this movie really, really shocked me because I'm not a wrestling fan at all. But just the performances in here and just learning about the story of the Von Erichs really, really surprised me. And so The Iron Claw, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, surprise of the year for me. And that is it. Let me know of your biggest disappointments and surprises of 2023. And that is it. I'm already exhausted from making this video, so I can't imagine how exhausted I will be from making my end of the year tier list. But yeah. Let me know your guys' lists, and that's pretty much it. We got the end of the year tier list to make, obviously, after this, so make sure you go check that out. Make sure you go check out my previous videos if you haven't seen them yet, and I do have a few movies on my radar for this month, so expect a few reviews, but going to be a slower month for January, obviously, but we got the big release of the end of the year tier list, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, happy 2024. We are officially here, and that's it. Like and subscribe, guys, and I will see you next time.